So this is the last event of this conference, and Boris Kagarlitzky will speak. He was already introduced. He's the current director of the Institute for Globalization Studies and Social Movements in Moscow, and a professor at the Moscow School for Social and Economic Sciences. And also the founder and editor of the Institute's paper Levaya Politica. Kind of biographical side note, he was in the 80s and later for a short time in 93, he was imprisoned for oppositional activity. Really since then and before he has published numerous books. The first that came out in English was the Thinking Read, which I can very much recommend, history of Soviet intellectuals from the 10s and 20s up to the 90s. His last book was a book called From Discourse to Class, which just came out a few months ago in Russian and might be translated into English if there will be funding for translation. So, yes, welcome, Boris, again, and I'll leave it to you.
Okay, thank you very much. And again, I'm quite happy to be with the Platypus people again, which is my third engagement at a Platypus conference. And by the way, each time in a different country. First it was in the United States, in New York, then it was in Vienna, in Austria, now it's in London. And of course, the situation is a bit odd because being Russian, I am invited to speak about Donald Trump. Though there is something symbolic to it, of course. Of course, I have to apologize for this kind of arrogance. However, I think I do have some ideas which I want to share with you. And really, maybe in some sense, it is quite logical that we are going this way because you see, my feeling is that American debates about Donald Trump are too emotional and very often not really involving enough political analysis and especially class analysis. And in that sense, what we can do is to exercise a bit of what Germans call Verfremdung, just estrangement, like you're looking at a certain event or a certain process or certain object in a bit kind of estranged way. I don't know whether it's a proper translation for this German word, which is the Brechtian term. It was Bertolt Brecht which used the term. By the way, we also had problems translating it into Russian, so it's a very German term. So it needs to be explained rather than translated. But anyhow, the idea that you're estranging, making something kind of look as if it is just new to you. And in that sense, maybe asking a person from a non-English speaking world to speak about these things is exactly the right approach to do that. So, let's then go back to the original topic. And the first thing I want to point to is exactly the tremendous emotionality of the so-called Trump debate even before Donald Trump came to power. So the emotional side was quite pathetic in a way because everything was discussed in a very aggressive way, both by the liberal media and by the left. But was the debate political? Actually, it was not. It was very much about what did Trump say on women? What did Trump say on Muslims? What did Trump say on Mexicans? Did he offend Mexicans or he didn't? He actually did. But was that so important from the point of view of politics? To some extent, yes, it was. But it's not enough just to make a political judgment. And the very fact that Donald Trump was definitely politically incorrect in his speech was a major issue to be discussed by both left-wing and liberal media in the United States. But at the same time, all of a sudden, one could discover that this was exactly working into his hands, because all of a sudden it was becoming clear that it was exactly this political incorrectness which was actually attracting people to him rather than distracting them. And here we have to think not so much in cultural terms, because of course that was also discussed, and people who became Trump voters were immediately accused of being racists and xenophobes and homophobes and whatever phobes of or whatever, any kind of phobia which could be discovered in the current culture was attributed to these people. And again, the point is that quite possibly quite a few of them were really xenophobic and homophobic and so on and so on. But it doesn't mean that this explains what was actually happening. And it doesn't even mean what was making these people behave like that. Because also yesterday we heard, for example, this very typical discourse about Brexit, which actually makes me feel almost sick in Great Britain when British left-wing and left-liberal intellectuals discuss the attitudes of British working class, saying that, well, these people are racists, hooligans, xenophobes, and so on and so on. And again, I'm not saying that these people are necessarily, I mean, all these workers are not necessarily so much better than intellectuals say. But still, that makes me really, really embarrassed, because is it a kind of attitude which should be characteristic of intellectuals, left-wing intellectuals speaking about workers? Is just pointing to the cultural backwardness of the workers necessarily the main thing to be discussed about workers? Shouldn't we just see that these workers, who are possibly, yes, culturally quite backward, no doubt about it, have also other reasons to behave politically the way they behave? So, again, I'm not saying that these cultural problems don't exist. What I'm saying is that reducing politics to culture is very dangerous, and it leads us to very wrong conclusions, like not seeing objective reasons and objective trends which lead people to behave the way they behave, and leads us not seeing the objective contradictions of interests which lead to specific political and social behavior. And this is very much the same thing with Donald Trump. And it's very interesting that in Russia for many years we had this problem with the Russian liberal pro-Western intellectuals who were mainly on the right, politically, on the right, new liberal intellectuals. They kept saying Russian people are backward, they are kind of politically incorrect, that they are stupid, that they are kind of possessing all the negative characters possibly imagined, and so on. So, and then you come to the point that, well, we have the wrong people. Russians are the wrong people. There is something wrong with the people in this country, in Russia. Well, the good people, they are the ones who live, say, in the United States or in Britain or in Germany or in Canada, whatever. These are the correct people. The people who are living in a country like Russia are incorrect, wrong people. And the problem is with the people. The problem is not with us. The problem is not with our politics. The problem is not with our discourse. The problem is with the people who do not accept that kind of brilliant new liberal progressive discourse. Interestingly enough, you discover very much the same kind of approach, but this time on the left, when it comes to the Trump debate and to Brexit debate in English-speaking world. Then what is beneath this debate? What is beneath this kind of discourse? I think there are a few things. First of all, it's very clear that objectively there kind of policies which were characteristic of the whole period from 1990s to about 2010 is coming to an end. We definitely see the exhaustion of the new liberal capitalist global model, and the problem is not ideological, because we always had the reasons to be opposed to that model from an ideological perspective, which doesn't change much. What changes much is that the objective resources for the model are now exhausted. What's wrong with the model from that perspective? I'm not speaking about the ideology or in terms of social justice or whatever. I'm just speaking about very practical things. One of the problems of with this model is that the basic element, the basic tendency of the neoliberal model was this famous race to the bottom. So in order to sell your products at the global market, you had to press down wages and standards in every single country. And the idea was very simple. You press down wages in your own country, and you press down standards in your own country, which makes you more competitive so that your products are cheaper. And for the global capital, also it is very important, if it is not satisfied with the wages and standards in a particular country, it moves yet to another country. And so it is both a race to the bottom, but also it's the famous spatial fix, what David Harvey called spatial fix. So in that sense that the problems of capitalism are solved not in terms of time, but in terms of space. So just moving from one country to another, looking for better conditions for capital investment and higher returns for capital. And less regulation. By the way, it's not always about money. One thing is, everybody thinks, wow, capitalists are looking for lower wages. Not necessarily. They're also looking for more power. So they're investing in the countries where they have more in control, and at least they're more in control over the labor force. Because if you're taking the case of China, they're not so much in control politically, but they're very much in control just at the factory level, much more than anywhere else. So this problem, however, leads us to a certain limit, because once everybody's running to the bottom, you finally reach the bottom. This race to the bottom leads you to the real bottom. You cannot keep depressing wages and standards without, in the long run, depressing the global market as well. Because the global market is, in the long run, the combination, the collection of local markets in the very long run. Because in the short term, it works the other way around. In the short term, you depress wages in your own country, which means you're more competitive vis-à-vis the rest of the world. But the problem is that the rest of the world is doing exactly the same. So you end up at the bottom. And the bottom line, or the last frontier, is also China. Why? Why China is so important? It's not only the problem of very cheap labor, which is not so cheap anymore, because once you develop a country, you develop industrial society, wages at some point begin to grow, whether you like it or not, just because you need people who are more skilled, who are more qualified, and you'll have more people developing specific demands and so on and so on. So even if you're pressing down wages globally, it doesn't mean that locally, where you have most of investment, wages are not growing. So, but China is also the society which provided capitalism not only with cheap labor, but the scale of production and the scale of exploitation, which is impossible to replicate anywhere else in the world, just because of the numbers of Chinese workers and the demographics of China. So China is definitely the last frontier in terms of this capital expansion. And at the same time, it seems that Western societies managed to reach the bottom. Because, okay, if you're going to China, you're going to have cheap labor, which is producing cheap goods, to be sold somewhere, not just in China. But if you're depressing wages in the so-called advanced capitalist societies, the purchasing power of these societies, the purchasing power of the population of these societies, is also depressing. And yes, of course, you have all these famous debt bubbles, because debt, credit they're absolutely essential for keeping demand alive, keeping demand going on. But again, there are limits. So the point about Western capitalism in, say, 1910 and after, is that it seems that we're kind of reaching certain limits within this new liberal model, so that there are no possibilities to continue going along these lines anymore, which is something which Hillel Tickton mentioned yesterday from a different perspective, because he said they're not investing anymore. Yes, it is true, but they're not investing also because there are no possible returns. And at the same time, you're coming to a very interesting phenomenon, because on the one hand, you have overaccumulation crisis, very much along the lines of Rosa Luxemburg. I also very much advise you to read this great book, Accumulation, Накопление капитала in Russian, Accumulation des Kapitals in German, Accumulation of the Capital. I don't know whether it exists in English, by the way. I hope it does. It's very long and actually a very boring book, which still deserves to be read. And so on the one hand, you have this overaccumulation crisis. On the other hand, you have a demand crisis. So it's a very interesting combination, because usually you have either one or another crisis, but now all these crises are coming together, and all other long-term problems of the capitalist system are also coming to the fore, whether it's an environment, whether it's all sorts of other problems. They're all these problems are also there, and they're not resolved. They're all accumulated, but all these things are coming together. So, and that is exactly the moment when some kind of new model of capitalist development and accumulation has to be offered or proposed in the advanced capitalist societies. And I think the interesting thing about Donald Trump is that Donald Trump doesn't have a model, and he didn't have a strategy, but he kind of had a feeling. So in that sense, there is no such thing as Trumponomics. But there is such thing as Trump feelings, or something like that. So that this guy kind of emotionally grasped the problem without really rationalizing it. And this was one thing which made him such an enfant terrible for the American capital, because he was actually kind of pointing to things everybody knew about, but nobody wanted to mention. So it's like a real troublemaker who's like, there is also a very good German term, which I love, also I don't have the English translation, Spielverderber, somebody who makes the game go wrong. So there are rules of the game. There are certain things you shouldn't mention. There are certain things you shouldn't speak about. And they are there. It's like we call it in Russia we call it the white monkey phenomena. So there is a white monkey somewhere in the room, but nobody has to mention the fact that the monkey is in the room, right? Pretend it doesn't exist there, or the black cat, whatever. So
it makes the game less fun.
Yes. So, but anyhow, so one thing which happened was that Donald Trump was not part of the political class, and that allowed him to make certain statements pointing to the problems, which others pretend not to exist, which doesn't mean that he had solutions. So in that sense, Donald Trump's function, objectively and culturally and politically, I think, was very much to expose the problems of the ruling elite, not providing reasonable solutions to these problems. And by the way, it doesn't mean that there are no solutions, even within capitalism. There could be solutions, but Donald Trump was not capable to provide these solutions, at least up to now. Why? And here we're coming to the other aspect, the class formation of Trump coalition. So it's quite well known that the core of Trump electorate were so-called white workers. In fact, if you're looking at the statistics, you're looking at the demographics of Trump electorate, you discover that quite a few of these white workers were not white, and quite a few white men were women, actually. So in that sense, what you discover is some other problem with not saying the right words. Liberal intellectuals didn't want to speak about working class. Why? Because they didn't want to accept that something was wrong, not necessarily with the working class, but with them vis-à-vis the working class. That they failed the working class quite a few times. And that's why it was not them failing the working class, but the working class being replaced by this mythological character, a white man, who was referred to as a person representing all the negative cultural problems, which really do exist. The point is, these problems are not invented. But this character is just reduced to these cultural problems. There is nothing else than that. It's just a bureau of some negative cultural characteristics, period. No social interests, no class interests, no economic interests, just negative cultural characteristics, period. Though, of course, to some extent it was revealed and made public by a few American writers. I very much recommend to read Tom Frank. Probably Americans, if there are Americans here, who probably know the name, Tom Frank, and his book What Happened to Kansas, where he really did refer to some of these things. But anyhow, it was very clear that liberal intelligentsia was actually quite easily going along with the globalization, with the job reduction, with deindustrialization of the famous industrial areas. What's the term? The Rust Belt things and so on. And it's quite understandable that these people, being betrayed by the left and by the liberals and by the Democrats, at some point had to look elsewhere. And that was always this idea. By the way, also the New Labour in Britain had the same feeling. Okay, these workers, all these people, the blue-collar people, they will vote for us anyhow. They have nowhere to go. There is no way. So we have to forget about them and look at some other electorate, some other social base, and these people, they will follow us no matter what, because they have nowhere to go. And then at some point, something and somebody appears, and there is an option. There is elsewhere to go. And they go there, eagerly and actively. So, what makes them follow Trump? The promise of protectionism. This is very clear. And here we're coming to the really important point. I think that at this stage, if there is any future for protection, for capitalism, protectionism is the future of capitalism. If you want to stabilize the current capitalist accumulation process, it can only be stabilized through protectionism. But protectionism also means two things. First, you have to undermine quite a few interests which are dominant within leading capitalist countries. So it's not only that you have to go protectionist, it's also a problem with quite a few capitalist dominant interests which are currently leading these countries. And second problem here is that capitalist protectionism is necessarily producing more international conflicts and tensions. So inevitably, on the one hand, you are going into this direction, and you have to go this direction as long as you're within capitalism.
Isn't capitalist protection also a race to the bottom?
Not necessarily. I'll come to that. Because there are two different options. There are exactly different options. But if you're going to capitalist protectionism, you are going to get into all these contradictions and conflicts, and you're actually exposing already existing conflicts and making them more dramatic rather than resolving them, at least in the short term. However, protectionism at some point seemed to be something which could bring together workers, low middle classes, actually certain sections of small bourgeoisie, like shopkeepers, whatever, people who are running small businesses at the local level, and some sections of industrial bourgeoisie or some investors also. It's not an accident that Donald Trump is in the construction sector, because this is exactly something you do locally. You build locally. You can, well, okay, you can build in China as well, but I mean, as long as you're in this hospitality and construction sector, like building hotels and so on, it's very much like you are interested in a specific local markets and a specific local demand and so on. Also, in a way, you should understand that Donald Trump doesn't represent the highest level of American or transnational bourgeoisie because, well, this guy is enormously rich. $3 to $4 billion, right? It's enormous money for us, for any of us. It's just, you cannot even imagine that much money. Eh? Well, from the point of view of multinationals, it's not such a big money, because multinationals operate with hundreds of billions of dollars. So compared to, I don't know, to the big multinationals, Donald Trump with his empire is a tiny little guy. And so in that sense, it was also a kind of rebellion of one section of bourgeoisie against another. And then what brings together the blue-collar workers, some sections of petty bourgeoisie, medium level investors, and so on, all these very different groups which have very different interests. And they're presenting very different class interests. As I told you again, protectionism, yes. But what kind of protectionism? Because protectionism itself is immediately becoming a contested issue. Because what workers expect from protectionism is they want their jobs to be protected. And they want jobs to be created. And they want higher wages. Which is not necessarily what the capitalists want from protectionism. It's not that much about wages. They want probably to sell more goods. Well, this is now the famous contradiction, because every single capitalist would be very happy if their wages are increasing at a factory which belongs to another capitalist, but not at his own factory. Right? This is quite logical. If wages are increasing elsewhere, I can sell there. If wages are increasing at my own enterprise, I'm getting less profits. So this is a contradiction. And that's why, by the way, America needed Roosevelt. Because somebody had to make capitalist class behave as one thing, as one piece, rather than as a collection of individual entrepreneurs competing each other. So, in that sense, ironically, every time you have any kind of protectionist policies which really work, there must be a lot of coercion within capitalist system, but against individual capitalists. So you have to discipline and coerce individual capitalists in the interests of the capitalist class as a whole. By the way, it's not so different compared to the working class. I really loved a point in George Lukács' work, when he said the dictatorship of the proletariat is not only about suppressing the enemies of the proletariat, it's also about disciplining the workers themselves, so that the interest of class go above the interest of every individual worker. And there can be a contradiction. So that happens within every class. So, but anyhow, in this case, what we see is that protectionism is an issue, a potential to be contested, even as long as we accept the very idea that, yes, protectionism is something we need objectively. We're all coming together under the banner of protectionism. And then the problems begin, because it's not the end of the problem, it's just the beginning. Because there are lots and lots of practical things. So the problem with Donald Trump is that he never went beyond this first step. And here is exactly the big problem Donald Trump faced already in his first, I think, weeks in power. And the problem is that if you go deeper into detail, the more you kind of concretize your policies, the more you risk alienating certain sections of your own bloc which brought you into power. Because, as I told you, it's a collection of very contradictory interests. But if you don't do anything, you're also risking to fail. Because then people are getting frustrated that nothing is done, nothing is achieved. So I think that was the key issue of the first year of Donald Trump. Once he came to power with the support of a very heterogeneous, very contradictory alliance, which was not even a coalition. Because a coalition means that you come together and reasonably and rationally formulate an agreement. What brings you together? A compromise. But as a populist movement, Trump movement never had a formulated and rationalized compromise formula. And this is another very important aspect of populism. So it's very emotional and very informal, and everything is based on some kind of intuition.
So was Obama too, right?
So of course, that's American politics anyhow. To some extent, it's Russian politics as well. But what I mean is, in this particular case, this was exactly the point when there was some kind of feeling rather than agreement. Have a common feeling rather than a common agreement, which have to reach in a rational way. Because if you have a rational agreement, if you have a proper formal coalition, then, well, okay, even if something is not achieved, then you can discuss it in some way. There will be a new compromise made or remade or whatever. But as long as you're facing this situation of spontaneous, emotional, quasi-integration of forces, what happens is that in the long run you're risking all these forces to disintegrate again. And this is why I think after making a few very impressive first steps, which were impressive in the sense that they were also very much about propaganda, about public relations, than about real things, Trump administration got paralyzed. So because everybody speaks about Trump administration as being incompetent, as being full of contradictions, as being full of different ideological groups which are fighting each other, whether it's Steve Bannon or whatever, the old Republicans and so on, which is all true. But if you go beneath the surface, deeper into the detail, you understand that there is a contradiction of class interests which makes these things happen. And actually when you see people like Steve Bannon, who is now very angry at Donald Trump, and actually is rebelling against Donald Trump after being so instrumental to bring him to power, what is beneath that? It's not that much the character of Steve Bannon or some other characters like him, but it's very much this feeling of frustration which emerges out of the inability of this kind of coalition or this kind of movement to deliver anything concrete to anyone, and the inability to deliver anything for the working class, for the blue-collar workers, which is at the same time expressed in a completely inadequate or I should say perverse ideological way. Because what you have with all these alt-right people, it's a complete perversion. What I really loved when Steve Bannon was speaking about himself as a Leninist. I mean, that's really incredible. So you have a person from the far right referring to Lenin as his kind of ideal of politics. So that I mean, of course, he understood Lenin in a purely technological, purely technical, political technical sense. But I mean, it just gives you the idea of the level of confusion that people are not even able to find the right characters to refer to, according to their own ideology. Anyhow, what was the result? So far, not so much. So far, they even failed to build the famous wall with Mexico. Instead of discussing relations between the United States and Mexico at the economic level, they discussed the design of the wall and failed to reach an agreement about the design of the wall. The wall is not there yet, and maybe it's not going to be there anyway, because they were unable to reach an agreement about what they originally wanted to do, rather than discussing the design of the wall. So, at this very time, all the forces which were opposed to this protectionist turn more or less consolidated themselves. And it's very interesting that initially what you saw with Donald Trump, it was this kind of hysteria among American liberal circles. Well, there is quite a lot of hysteria even now, but I think there is less of a hysteria. And just compare Davos this year and Davos a year ago. Davos a year ago, they were really panicking. And just remember the guy from Russia, Anatoly Chubais, who's famous as the father of Russian privatization, who arrived to Davos and said Donald Trump is going to destroy everything we built up for so many years. And it was very interesting, his speech of Chubais. I don't know whether it was translated into English, because it was really pathetic, because he said, well, Chinese Communist Party, they do represent the right policies, because they're for free trade, for privatization, for private enterprise. So Chinese communists are the good guys. We love them. But this American capitalist Donald Trump, he's a disaster. He's very dangerous. He's going to destroy capitalism. So that was the kind of speech which I really loved. However, this year I think these people are not so hysterical. They're not so panicking. They feel much more comfortable. Why? Because they know that Donald Trump didn't get far away from where he started. There is a Russian joke about a steamer not moving because all the steam goes into the whistle. So in that sense, I shouldn't say that that all the steam went into the whistle, but much of the steam went into the whistle. And then at that point, of course, this administration definitely needed some achievement or something to really happen, to present as an achievement. And I think they were quite consciously pushed towards a sort of new international conflict. And they were pushed in two directions. On the one hand, you have North Korea. Donald Trump had no foreign policy, had no experience with foreign policy, and he didn't have even an idea of foreign policy before he arrived to the White House. So it was exactly the kind of president which had to be pushed into foreign policy area to be drowned there. And I don't think he was so naive as not to understand that, but he didn't have much of a choice, because nothing was really happening at the local level, except that the Republican Congress was working on its own with all sorts of legislation, which actually doesn't come from Trump campaign at all. Because now what you see is that the kind of new set of neoliberal and austerity policies, which are definitely pushed through the Congress, and it's going on as if, just more of the same and worse. So Trump is going to be responsible for that anyhow, just because he doesn't dare to say, I have nothing to do with that, so he goes along with that. So it's not going to be something which his friends who voted for him will be very happy with. Work with all the stuff with Medicare, it's not something people will be happy. Sorry?
I'm not sure how true that strikes me, because you said sort of your thesis was the model so far has been the global race to the bottom, that's reached the bottom, but it's not really materializing what's coming after. But I think it's relatively.
Can we have maybe those more?
We will have more
details.
questions. More questions. No, but no. You see, the point is that when I'm saying that austerity and other policies are exhausted, doesn't mean that they cannot be pushed through technically. What I mean is that they're not going to work. This is a very important point. In terms of the race to the bottom, yeah, you can do the race to the bottom. You can continue further, but the problem is it's not going to work. You're going to have backlash. You're going to have it will fail immediately. It will not even work according to the terms of those people who want these policies. You see, who are pressing for these policies. But anyhow, so what I'm saying is that definitely there is no attempt to reverse the race to the bottom in the United States in terms of domestic social policies. At the same time, Trump has definitely pushed into the area of foreign policy where he is definitely incompetent. He doesn't know what to do, and he actually happened to hit two very tough targets, because one target is North Korea, another target is Russia. And speaking about North Korea, what can you do about North Korean regime? There is very little you can do about it, because as long as you don't start the actual nuclear war, there is no way you can influence these people. And this is exactly the North Korean policy. North Koreans are no idiots. They just know that they're much weaker than all their enemies and partners. So their policy is to blackmail the stronger rivals and partners by saying we are totally responsible. So you have to be very careful with us, because we can do anything. So it's like, well, you can see that in American movies and American westerns. There you can find some characters like that, right?
Works like a teenager acting out.
Yes, maybe, yeah, but it works. In case of North Korea, it does work. They're in power. Actually, the economy is growing. By the way, they managed to overcome the catastrophic crisis of the late 90s, because for example, Chinese don't really like them, but Chinese have to give them money and resources to develop their economy, because Chinese are also scared because North Koreans can create a lot of trouble just next door. So they're doing rather well, on their own terms, of course. I mean, I imagine no one among us would love to go there and stay there. But I mean, in terms of how things happen there, as one friend of mine who's a Korean expert said, it's like the heat in a hell is a little bit decreasing. So it's still a hell, but the temperature is little less, which can be seen as a success within the hell. If you live within the hell, why not? I mean, it's a step forward. And yes, and now I'm finishing. So so one target, which is North Korea, didn't work out the way anybody expected. I mean, it looks like a total failure. Things are not moving anywhere. Russia, actually, American policies on Russia may work, by the way. Contrary to what Russian government is saying, we don't care about what they do to us. I think these policies can work and may work. But
In what way?
In what way? There'll be more and more disasters within Russian elite. They will be fighting each other. They'll be fighting each other. And Russian elite is deeply split. But they're trying not to show that to the foreigners. But the problem is that they're so deeply split, but that at some point that will come out. So in that sense, it can work, but probably it may work, but it will not work the way to help Trump and his friends, at least not in the immediate terms. So finishing, I think that there are 2 points which I wanted to make. First, if we said protectionism is a kind of future of capitalism, but at the same time, capitalism cannot, at this point, realize any coherent protectionist strategy. And that's the problem of Trump, and that's the problem of all other capitalist leaders. The question is whether some kind of progressive or socially oriented protectionism is possible as an alternative if Trump and others fail. So whether we have people like Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders as an alternative within these very same lines, but trying to present a more coherent and more progressive version of protectionism oriented towards, as I said, reversing the race to the bottom, making capitalist class accept that, well, you have to increase wages and living standards and, well, go along the Keynesian or neo-Keynesian lines. I do not exclude that opportunity, but it's also the question of class struggle. Because then you're coming to the issue of whether they'll So in that sense, Bernie did play a positive role globally and morally and ideologically. But the question is, it's not enough. You have to develop the whole set of ideas coming from social interests and developing that on the basis of social interests. And you have to deal with concerns and worries of individual workers and people at the bottom. You have to deal with them. You have to stop saying, well, these people are just, I don't know, not politically correct, period. You have to understand why they're not so politically correct, why they're so politically incorrect. You have to deal with their worries.
So, Laurie?
So, protectionism seems to be a topic. And it's interesting because, of course, when you first said it, I was like, but you, as you went on and you explained it, of course, it was much more rich of the understanding that I have of protectionism. But then it sort of, your description of it actually sounded to something that might be very familiar to Marxists, which is whether or not this is the new form that Bonapartism is taking. And what actually you're describing is the new form that Bonapartism is taking. And so I'm wondering, with regards to whether you agree with that, whether there's a sense of also continuity in this change that can help a room filled with Marxists, or people who consider themselves Marxism important. If we're not Marxists, we consider that important to trying to understand the historical moment that we're in. And the way that, we can then think about what is the left, how does the left understand this unique problem that we're being faced with right now. So I would be curious to you if you think that Bonapartism is relevant to your understanding of protectionism in terms of how, Trump is relating to global capital, how it's responding to our crisis, and whether that shift can be, in that sense, then also a moment of clarity for the left with regards to the fact that Bonapartism only matters to Marxism to the degree that it allows you to understand the necessity of the leadership of the party, right? Like taking power. Why? And if somehow, like this present moment can, this idea of protectionism that you presented, allows us to perhaps put that into view.
Well, Bonapartism, as we mentioned yesterday, was and is very much about state power. And the left shouldn't be just about state power. The left should be about class interests, mobilization, and movements. So, and I yesterday mentioned, and I'd rather prefer Gramscian term Cesarismo, Caesarism, because Gramsci developed that quite a lot in his prison notebooks. And I think that, yes, there can be an option for some kind of progressive Caesarism or progressive Bonapartism. But here is a big problem, because Bonapartist policies, even when they're progressive, they're not democratic. They're by definition undemocratic, because it's always about the leadership which balances between different forces, and it's not based on an organized compromise. So what will be the left-wing alternative? I think some kind of historic compromise, using again the terms of Italian Communist Party, though in Italy today the very idea of historic compromise has a very negative connotation, because as you know, what the Communist Party leadership called historic compromise in the 1970s was actually an attempt to make a deal with the Christian Democrats, which ended up in a disaster. So in that sense, again, this is a Gramscian term, which probably in Italy will produce a very negative connotation. But what I mean is that some kind of historic bloc is necessary, and historic bloc is a matter of real politics, in the sense that, Russia. If you take Russian Revolution, what was Bolshevism? Bolshevism was a historic bloc which actually changed its nature through the period of civil war, even, because the kind of historic bloc which brought Bolsheviks to power was not exactly the same which allowed them to win the civil war. It was reshaped and changed and reorganized, and in the 1920s, when they had new economic policies, again they reshaped the formation, which doesn't mean that Lenin was a Bonapartist, because it was all based on direct discussions with different forces, and there was an element of a Bonapartist approach, which in the long run led to Stalinism, as we know, right? But in fact, it was all based on rational compromises rather than just manipulation and just balancing, right? It was more than just balancing. It was based on social interests. So I think that in that sense, yes, the left has to go for some kind of progressive Cesarismo in that sense, but only in that sense, not in the sense of essence, but not in the sense of political technologies. Because these authoritarian political technologies are something which we have to avoid, which totally contradicts our very, very idea of thinking.
So, Richard was next.
Yeah. So, I don't. I mean, my instinct is to regard any form of protectionism as regression, and I don't even know if it's possible. But I don't see it as progressive. But I wanted to get to a different question, which was about like the actual sort of mechanics of the politics that led to Trump. So I mean, two or three things struck me. One is that the Republican leadership couldn't unite behind any other candidate to stop Trump. In other words, Trump could have been stopped by the Republican leadership, but they couldn't do that. And also the weakness of Hillary Clinton politically, which was very surprising vis-a-vis the Sanders challenge. So when you speak about the hysteria, that's completely accurate and describes the liberal and centrist wing of American politics. And so when you read the Washington Post, it's like reading the controlled press, like some Stalinist country. It's, enemy of the people and all of that. But what's more interesting is the ambivalence of conservatives and the incoherence of their response. So, I mean, again, you speak about and I think there is a kind of weakness and chaos of the Trump presidency. But again, what's really surprising about that is that he has his own party in power, the majority of both houses. So it's really about the ambivalence of the Republicans' leadership vis-a-vis Donald Trump and the conservative establishment and the fighting between conservatives. And also you see an echo of that on the marginal left, in that there is a kind of ambivalence about Trump also in parts of the more or less far left. Right? It's not. I think that to some extent. It's hard to sort of, I mean, you don't see sort of pro-Trump sentiment on the left, but you see gradations of response and sort of a sense of not quite knowing what to make of the phenomenon. And I think there is, again, also because of the hysteria, I mean, there is definitely a sense that the political center of gravity on the left has shifted to the right in terms of, like, the phenomenal growth of the DSA is partly a Sanders phenomenon, but it's also come at the expense of, say, some group like the ISO. In other words, it's sort of as though the left has said, now the only future is in the Democratic Party. I'm not saying the whole left, but I'm saying the idea that there would be any mass organization or any ability. So I guess I wanted you to speak about, like, that political mechanics. Like, why do you think the Republican leadership couldn't unite to stop Donald Trump? I mean, there was to me, it seemed a slightly accidental quality to Donald Trump, as well as him being the representative of the moment. That, you know, if the Republican leadership had wanted to, they could have stopped him, but they couldn't. I mean, it wasn't that they wanted him, but they couldn't find anything better.
Well, first of all, you know this Marxist term that accident is something which allows the necessity to actually get through. So the necessity gets realized through a series of accidents. So in that sense, yeah, it was an accident, but it was part of the necessity as well. So there was a more basic, deeper mechanism of political crisis which was preconditioning these series of accidents, which of course could be avoided, but maybe if they were avoided, something else could happen which could lead probably to similar consequences or some other consequences which could be comparable. So we just cannot say. By the way, speaking about protectionism, I understand this sounds like a bad word, but what's the alternative to protectionism within capitalism? It's free trade. It doesn't mean that the left has to be pro-free trade. I mean, within the capitalist approach. And actually, this is exactly the big problem, because Keynesianism and all sorts of other progressive policies were carried out in the context of protectionism. However, much of the reactionary policies were also carried out within the framework of protectionism. So in that sense, protectionism is extremely ambivalent. That's why I'm saying the question is not whether it's about protectionism or against protectionism, but what are we going to protect? Whom are we going to protect? Why are we going to protect them, and so on. So speaking about the Republicans, I think that on the one hand, yes, the Republican Party was extremely confused and divided, but however, Democrats were confused and divided to a similar extent. So what we saw in 2016, I guess, was a very deep crisis of the two-party system as such. And actually, I think it is continuing. I don't think it's overcome. By the way, I think it's really a very dangerous policy saying that only within the Democratic Party you can build up some kind of progressive movement, because the Democratic Party itself is part of the problem, and it's very much in crisis. And the very fact that Bernie Sanders was afraid of really dropping his quasi-affiliation with the Democrats, or was afraid of really breaking with them before Philadelphia, when many people left the Congress. I think they preconditioned the defeat of the left. So there was a lack of political imagination and political will to go beyond the two-party system, which probably still is going to be the same, be the case in 2020 again. And as for the Republicans, I think that the Republican establishment really didn't have a policy. They didn't have not only they didn't have a leader to bring them together, but they didn't have a policy to bring them together. And they, at some point, initially, I think they were not expecting to have a chance to win. That was very much, I think, the feeling within the Republican establishment. So they didn't care. So they lost an opportunity to stop Trump at the initial stage, when they didn't care. Okay, he's going to lose anyhow. So it's better if he loses than one of us loses. That's quite reasonable. Well, and then, well, it was too late already.
So how many people we have left? Because after, I would say, last round of questions, and then we're gonna wrap up. So Alex, and then we have Jim and Pam, and you also. No. Alex.
So during these transitional periods within capitalism, if you
What?
call it, during these transitional moments in capitalism, we call this like a reorientation of capitalism. What it always makes me think of is, so what were the missed opportunities of the previous moment? What were the demands that brought about the previous epoch? What did they point to? What kind of like possibilities? How those were missed opportunities? And then what does that mean about the upcoming period, and how these like missed opportunities are going to be festering? So like this dynamic of like there's going to be something new about the transition from what we call neoliberalism into protectionism or whatever is going to emerge. And how do you think like this is going to play out? What the old and the new?
Well, the question is transition to what? Again, I think that when I'm saying that the era of protectionism is coming, it doesn't mean I know what kind of protections we're going to end up with. That's the first thing. As for there are missed opportunities, I think there are plenty of them, but there are always missed opportunities. But also there were quite a lot of achievements and opportunities which were not considered properly. For example, the left, it was mentioned yesterday, the left was very critical of the welfare state in the 1960s till it started getting dismantled by the neoliberals. Then the left started fighting back, defending the welfare state rather than working on its development and working on its reconsolidation and reconsideration. What's the meaning of the welfare state? And I actually think that the period of transition from capitalism to socialism, it's exactly the period we are in, but the period started maybe in 1917, it's still going on, and still will continue for a while. Because the original social democratic Kautskian and the Stalinist idea was you first take power, then you introduce socialism from above. And I don't think it is that simple. I think that it's quite a few elements of socialism are really emerging within capitalism, and they're really emerging in the institutional forms, in political forms and social forms. And then the question of new liberalism is exactly that the bourgeoisie understood that much better than the left. So the bourgeoisie started purging capitalism from socialist elements, and the left only understood the importance of what was happening too late when they lost a few defensive struggles. So now the question is whether we can go back into the offensive with this new agenda of the new welfare state, but understanding that welfare state is just something much more than about redistribution, for example, or about having higher wages for workers or a little bit more job security for workers, but it's more like an institutional logic which is different compared to the logic of profit and capitalism. So if we're going for that, then we have some kind of offensive perspective.
Jim?
Yeah, I just want to have like a kind of more clear maybe concept or picture of what you're pointing to, saying we will focus, or the left has to focus on protectionism. Both in terms of the left itself, what is a program for a left then, or what is activism for a left, or politics, and also in terms of capitalism itself, like how would you think it will look like in the future? I mean, for example, China, an example for it, for protectionist or very strong state policy. They can, like, in every moment close the market and open it again or something. Or even you mentioned North Korea. Is North Korea a model for it?
No.
This is protectionism. This is real protectionism, and you say it's getting better there.
Well, definitely, I'm not.
But I mean, if we push Sanders or something, what are we pointing to?
Well, first of all, of course, I imagine you don't expect North Korea to be the model. I hope so. I can tell lots of stories about North Korea from my Korean friends, but it's better not to do it because it'll make you even more frustrated about the perspectives of communism. Seriously, I think first of all, it's a very interesting that you kind of grasp almost grab this term protectionism, and everybody started protectionism, because I think. Yes, I did mention that to be a little bit provocative, but the point is that it's not at the center, at the core. The core thing is new welfare state, rather than protectionism. Just one point you have to realize that you cannot go for a new welfare state or welfare expansionist perspectives, Keynesian or left Keynesian or whatever, Marxist Keynesian, without at least addressing the issue of protectionism. You see, that's the point. It doesn't mean that protectionism has to be at the core of our activities, not at all. What I mean is you have to consider that there is an aspect to it. And I think basically, well, for me it's much easier to speak about Russia in the sense that we know what has to be done in Russia. It's very easy. But I think American problems are very similar in many ways. So infrastructure is, well, I shouldn't say crumbling, but compare that with some Russian infrastructure, it's not so crumbling. But anyhow, well, you have all these problems with the welfare state, with infrastructure, with jobs to be created around human issues and so on. By the way, speaking about automation, what about people taking care of other people, of children, of aging people and so on? Are you expecting that to be done by the robots? Probably not. So there are plenty of ways you can expand this public sector enterprise. But the interesting point here is whether we can develop a new concept of a public sector enterprise, which is very important, which is going to be productive public sector enterprise. It's not about redistribution. It should be about production. And if we are Marxists here, we should think in terms of production, not just distribution. That's a key issue which divides Marxist approach from social democratic approach. Social democrats are saying about redistribution of wealth. We have to think also in terms of production of wealth. And so in that sense, new public sector must be about production also, not just about distribution.
Okay, then with Pam.
Two questions. The first is about this whole protectionism characterization, but I don't know if you're reading the response from the audience correctly. I don't think that people are like, oh, Boris is saying protectionism is so controversial, but I get the sense that maybe it's a bit like we have been dealing with this transformation and this possibility of the new, and you've introduced your comments as like this new stage of capital accumulation, right? And yet the left often uses these terms of fitting the potentially new back into what it already knows. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with the way it understands its own place in opposition to the capital transformation. Because as soon as you say, well, what we're going to go into is protectionism, then you just said it right now, then the response is a kind of like propping up of the welfare state, right? Which is a kind of return, right? It's a kind of like looking back. And yet I wonder, yesterday you introduced you said, politics is the art of the real, right? And if the real is actually undergoing a transformation that we may not sort of understand and know, is the left out of step with reality when it tries to fit someone like Trump back into an old model? Because I'm not entirely convinced that it's simply a case of protectionism, and I know that it matters what we mean by that. But Trump will say things like he wants to negotiate better on the world scale so that the United States can still be an international leader but get a better deal, and that in order to do that you have to threaten to walk out. But it's not necessarily the case that he might want to walk out, right? And that's not necessarily a cutting off the United States from the rest of the world in this way. And so it just raises this issue of how the left understands itself in response to the new, and whether it's retreating from the new by using terms from the past to understand what could be potentially disorienting and yet important to grasp. And on that note, I'm curious about how you characterize the political crisis. At the beginning of your comments, you said the problems here are not ideological. And you said, you sort of gave us a rundown on how you think that Trump came to power, in part by accident, but also you said as a kind of conflict between the bourgeoisie that has local interest, between a bourgeoisie that has greater international interests. And that you saw Trump as a kind of result of the objective contradiction of interests. And something that I think Chris has been emphasizing is how what's really changing in the current moment is the transformation of the Republican Party, and that it's an ideological crisis, and that in fact that may be the thing that leftists have to pay attention to. And so I'm wondering, like, because revolution is not in the offing, do you think that, and what are the lessons that could be socialists could learn about this crisis in bourgeois politics? Is it just to like affirm to oneself that the bourgeoisie struggles within itself, or is there something else, the dimension of politics, rather than the objective contradiction that we're affirming to ourselves?
Well, of course, I'm not saying that ideology is unimportant. I was just saying that we have to go beyond and look beyond ideology. But speaking about politics, first of all, there is one issue which is desperately missing from the left-wing debates now. It's the issue of power. Why? Partly because we are so weak that we are not in a position to speak in terms of power politics. That's quite understandable. However, unless we begin to at least to think in these terms, it's very hard to go into real political life with something which can be considered to be our own initiative. Because politics is something about power in the long run. The question is whether it's just government or class power. Of course, it's more about class power than about government. But again, well, these things are intertwined. So you cannot just avoid speaking about government, policy and struggle for government power. At the same time, saying, well, class power is something much more broad, much more important, but still they're intertwined. Shouldn't just drop it. Okay, the left is conceptualizing the present and the future in the terms of the past, but that's normal for human beings. We have no other experience except the experience of the past, so that's something we have to use the terms of the past. Often these terms are not exactly adequate. It's true. So it's a big problem. But what can we do about it? There should be as much political practice as possible. Without political practice, without practically doing things, there is very little chance we can develop some sort of new approaches and new understanding. So the question is how far we go in terms of practical things. I think here is the problem. Well, yes, okay. Probably I didn't answer your question properly, but there are more people with more questions.
You had a question?
I suppose I had a couple of hands already, more elegantly put, some of them, so I suppose I'll just have two brief questions. And the first was, you mentioned breakfast very briefly, but the conversation so far hasn't really discussed how, either protectionism, if you want to use that term, or how your sort of understanding relates to, say, the UK or, say, the European Union, say. There are obviously different levels. Pam mentioned ideology. I think Laurie mentioned Bonapartism, all of which are sort of like relevant certainly to the European Union. I sort of wondered what you sort of thought sort of going on there. I mean, can you really
where
in the European Union? Could you describe? Say Macron's, this two-speed Europe, this idea he has. That's this sort of new idea. Can that really be understood in sort of these terms, or do we need something else? I suppose the second question was then, well, you've mentioned, of course, the left shouldn't be merely concerned with like distribution, but also with production. I was sort of wondering then, well, what sort of alternative forms of production should the left sort of be like advocating then? Should it be either like cooperatives or something along those lines? Those are just two questions.
Well, very fast. Speaking about European Union, the Maastricht project and Lisbon project are neoliberal projects. In that sense, we cannot say Europe is a great idea, but something is wrong with it. No. Europe in its current institutionalized form is a neoliberal project. Period. That has to be understood. And the left just allowed itself to be trapped by this demagogy about Europe. And I really loved when Greeks were saying, we want to be part of Europe. Are they not? I mean, Greece is the quintessential element of Europe culturally. You cannot have Europe without Greece, right? And still Greeks were really blackmailed into this understanding of Europe, because Europe is the European Union. I think we Russians are very happy we are not part of the European Union. At least there is at least one good thing about our institutional system. Not so many others. But I think you cannot make an omelette without breaking eggs, actually. I think there is a crisis in the European Union. It's a good thing that there is a crisis. I think the left should exploit it rather than try to preserve the existing framework, which doesn't mean the very idea of Europe is bad. I mean, the idea of Europe is just like all nations living together in a peaceful way, cooperating. Why not? Why not? But should it be only realized through the framework of this Maastricht Union? I think not. Speaking about the new public sector enterprise, I think cooperatives and so on they are no solution. I think there must be a real public enterprise which is like socializing what could be seen as nationalized or state enterprises, like having new modes of management and organization within public sector, including democratic participation, participatory management, responsibility, transparency, external social control over public sector enterprises, and so on. So we have to develop a whole model of a new public sector enterprise. And by the way, there were very interesting experiments like in Scandinavian countries or Finland in the 1990s, for example, which have to be studied very carefully. So I think there is already a lot of experience. But again, here is a very interesting point. It's not just an issue of management or organization. It's also an issue of class power at the enterprise level. Who is in control? Which forces, which social interests are in control? Who calls the shots? So.
Is this not the same as in Yugoslavia?
Well, self-management in Yugoslav form was very much under control of the party. And in that sense, why was self-management such a failure in Yugoslavia, which was a failure in the long run, for two reasons. On the one hand, they had a very free market kind of economic framework. So you have a free management, self-managed enterprise, but operating on the free market, which meant that what's the real space for the self-management if it is just a free market economy? And on the other hand, you had a political party, which was the Communist Party, which was the only integrating force, which was an external integrating force, which was external to the collectives. It was not coming from in a bottom-up way, not arising from the self-management system, but it was very much imposed on the self-management system to bring these self-managing free trade enterprises together, which was a model which didn't work and shouldn't work, and it collapsed, and that was quite natural.
So last round of questions. So I see Nuncia and you, and then it's over.
And then we wrap up.
Yes.
So the issue of ideology was brought up, and this kind of like retroactive, these like retroactive demands upon forces of production. But you know, Marx spoke about how the proletariat had to take its poetry from the future. So I wonder, like, how does that reconcile with, like, how do you politicize people today? Because this is a point that you mentioned last night, like, well, we have to politicize class. So, like, what would that mean today?
Well, with Marxism, there is one very interesting point. See, why was Karl Marx so much in favor of the proletariat? Because Marx never said that he was in total agreement with the interests of the proletariat. What he said was that the interests of the proletariat are the ones which coincide with the interests of society and social development more than the interests of any other existing class in the current capitalist society. That was a very clear statement by Karl Marx, and I think it's exactly correct, because here we face an essential contradiction, because there are interests of the working class or proletariat or the toiling masses and so on, and there are general interests of social development, which in some cases go beyond interests, at least the interests of individual proletarians or their groups or whatever. Who is going to be the force to push forward the social interest? According to the late Bolshevik vision, it was the party, which was kind of illuminated with a good ideology, with a good understanding, scientific understanding, and was going beyond even the interests of the workers, of the working class, and so on. Well, unfortunately, it didn't work too well. So I'm not sure that we have an answer at this point. I'm just pointing that we have a problem here. But still, maybe some kind of political agency should be there, but we still don't have this agency. I don't know.
Is that the potential of this left protectionism?
Well, again, it's more than that. It's much more than that. I think the essential thing is where is society going? Who is leading? Where is the vanguard? On the one hand, the vanguard policies, the politics of vanguard, led us to some very unpleasant things, because we must understand that Stalinism is not the same thing as Lenin's Bolshevism, but still, Stalinism emerged out of Bolshevism. Stalinism is not the same thing as Bolshevism, but it emerged out of Bolshevism. So in that sense, Stalinism is one of the versions of Bolshevism in that sense, right? So should we be able to develop a different version? I don't know. I think we have to try. We have to try to create a political agency which goes beyond immediate interests. But honestly, I don't know how to do it. There must be a lot of social practice. We cannot just think it in advance. I just don't know.
I guess just following on from this theme that we seem to be pushing towards. You said earlier the question for protectionism is protectionism of what? But it's also the protectionism by whom?
Mm-hmm.
And the distinction of left populism and right populism doesn't seem to me a sufficient way to distinguish this question of an agent, subjective factor. And, you know, Hillel Ticktin pointed out on the panel last night that today a lot of people, if they kind of read the paper without the name on it, would consider Harold Macmillan's government to be very left-wing, you know, the Conservative Party of the 1950s. And a lot of what you're saying is actually being discussed in the British Conservative Party, right? Workers on the boards of companies, infrastructure, you know, because the gods are unkind to us, it's happening in this very confusing way with the British Conservative Party, where the move towards this kind of red Toryism was apparently failed in the last election, and now it's in this turmoil. But I think the so-called left and the Labour Party are they are doing what you're saying, they are pushing for the same thing. It will be led by the right, and they're holding on to their cultural politics in order to convince themselves that they're doing something different from the Conservatives, all the while they're asking for the same thing. And so that the turn to this kind of left populism is not shedding away the cultural politics that you want us to turn away from. It's just going to keep it as a way to excuse following the Conservative Party.
Well, first of all, the very fact that red Tories re-emerged, because they, historically it's not coming from the nowhere. There was a record, but the very fact that red Tories re-emerged is just showing to which extent the crisis of the system is deep and serious. So it's like both parties are in crisis in the United States and in Britain as well. So in that sense, red Tories emerge about the same time when Corbynistas are becoming prominent and leading the Labour Party. So in both ways, it's a reflection of the same crisis. But I think it's not an accident that red Tories failed within the Conservative Party, and so far Corbynistas at least are not failing within the Labour Party. They're technically at least they're doing rather well. And I think the left is ideologically in a much better position. It's much better fit to develop these new policies which are objectively necessary. But the question is whether the left is going to achieve something else than just contributing to the modernization of capitalist system. I think this is the biggest question, because I think some social change and institutional change is going to happen, but how progressive is going to be this change? Whether it's going to be achieved in a form of a more emancipatory and democratic transition, or just in a technocratic way. Look, if you are remembering what was happening in the 1930s, wait a minute, what was happening? Basically, the same kind of economic policies were technically introduced by New Deal and Roosevelt in the United States, by the Nazis in Germany, by the Front Populaire, the Popular Front in France. Some of the same measures were introduced by all these three governments. By the way, Stalin also did much of the same in many ways, you see, in the Soviet Union. So in that sense, you see the trend, you see where we are going. Wait a minute, but there is a tremendous difference whether it's Nazi regime or Front Populaire. So in that sense, the future is completely open. And it's very much something that depends on us, whether we are going to give this necessity a progressive meaning, emancipatory meaning, or we'll just follow the basic necessity within the capitalist system and accepting its logic as if we have no subjective will. So that's basically the problem of political will, whether we have it or not. And I think now the left is re-emerging as a political force. It was a cultural force. Now it's re-emerging as a political force. I mean, it's not yet there. It's just the very beginning. It's your generation which has to do it, by the way. It's very much your task, guys, to do it.
Okay, I think that's a good ending point.